Can I add my welcome to that of Riley? My name is Tim Mildenhall. I'm one of the ministers here, and it'd be great if you kept the Ruth passage open in front of you. We'll be looking today at the second last chapter of Ruth, Ruth chapter 3. And it was me who put Riley up to asking that question about marriage proposals, because obviously there's one in the passage. They're an interesting kind of thing, right? Full of lies, actually elaborate cover-ups. Riley would be a better way to describe it, to keep it under wraps as long as possible. People try to, try to find a unique way of doing this thing, which is so difficult. Even I was engaged a few years ago to hold up a sign quite sneakily along the harbour front at Luna Park, right, where a couple just happened to be passing along, and you can imagine her surprise when she saw this sign, X, will you marry me? And the next thing she saw was him kind of kneeling down. You get the picture. All of course, was captured by the designated videographer. And I guess you could hire professionals to make it all happen, be much easier. It's very stressful. But Ruth 3 gives us a really different kind of marriage proposal, right? Not only is there no videographer, but when you drill down, and here's the point, the people are not doing it for themselves, but for the sake of others involved in the story. It is a remarkable picture of a community of kindness, I think. And what it illustrates is the gentle art of putting others first. Our story opened, of course, 2 weeks ago in Ruth chapter 1 with empty stomachs, work in another country, and their death in that foreign land, with bitterness and uncertainty chasing a return to Naomi's birthplace. And in the middle of that, Ruth's chesed love. That Hebrew word, chesed, is often translated loving kindness, or in our Psalm 23, surely goodness and mercy, it's translated mercy there. Ruth and Naomi experienced in a big way what we all know. Their life is uncertain. Disaster can strike at any moment. And ordinarily, I'd say here in Sydney, we mostly think that applies to others, but not this week, not last week. But as is also true at the same time, Naomi experienced kindness, the kindness of Ruth. And last week in chapter 2, we saw Naomi in her bitterness and depression, unable to get out of bed. And Ruth trying to provide for herself and Naomi by gathering grain out in the fields during the barley harvest that just so happened to have started, by gleaning, getting the leftovers in someone else's field after they'd harvested. In those days, there were shadows over the land. It's the days of the judges, a time of dishonour and chaos when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was the possibility of harm coming to Ruth, a young, foreign, single woman, an outsider. That's mentioned both by Boaz and Naomi. And the worthy man covers her, spreads his protection over her, Boaz. This great kindness by Boaz, who noticed Ruth and provided for her well in excess of the laws that God had given Israel, laws designed to care for the poor and the outsider and to remind Israel that they had left slavery, they were poor and had no homeland. Laws which show God's chesed love operating in a community in front of all the nations. And Boaz's kindness, of course, was so great after that first day. Ruth took home to Naomi 22 litres of grain. I don't know how big a skirt was to be able to do that. I don't know how she did it. Blew her mind, Naomi's. And so we come to chapter 3, that famous midnight proposal scene down on the farm. And the heart of this chapter, and I think at the heart of this gentle and beautiful story of Ruth, is obviously loving kindness. Chesed love. God's chesed love, and the ways that love is shown to and by people in the story. And I think chapter 3 we get an exciting glimpse of how God's love and ordinary, earthy, human love intersect. But it isn't a rom-com, is it? Ruth's many things. It'd be kind of cool to know Ruth, I reckon. In verse 11 in our chapter, Boaz calls her a worthy woman. All my fellow townspeople know that you are a worthy woman, verse 11. And it's the same language used of the superwoman in the Bible in Proverbs 31. Did you know that? That inspiring and impossibly industrious, virtuous and effective woman. And Boaz is saying of her, you're a real catch. And interestingly enough, in chapter 2, when we met Boaz for the first time, that's the way he was introduced. Naomi had a relative of a husband, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. That phrase, you see, is a good indication that they're a good match for each other. They're both oriented towards the Lord. And it comes out in their actions as well. We meet Ruth, we meet Boaz. He significantly is the kind of relative who's got a redeemer role in that society. Being from the same clan and the redeemer, they were one designated to help out when disaster struck and people fell on hard times. When Israel came into the land, of course, each family was given a plot in perpetuity, and if a family fell on hard times and lost the land, then the Redeemer could buy back the land for that family, the lost land, so the family member could use it to generate wealth again, and so that God's promises could continue. Boaz is a Redeemer. This couple, Ruth and Boaz, are a good match. And by the end of the chapter, the marriage proposal's made, albeit at a slightly unusual time and place, and there's an engagement pledge even, of 6 measures of barley. And all that remains after this chapter is the highly anticipated answer. Will it work out? So there's the story. That's where the plot goes. But I've got to say, it raises a bunch of questions. I mean, what do you think? Well, here's one question. See, if Boaz is such a top bloke, respected by everyone from the city gate to his farm workers, and if he's got money and land and can, organise his workers, run a farm that employs them, why then in that culture is he not married already? Right? And even if he was a widower, how come he's not married again? I mean, remarriage was very common, if not the normal thing, because obviously he's got no compunction about being remarried. Ruth only doesn't have to ask him twice. He says yes to her, right? Straight away, he's got the plan worked out. I mean, he even knows there's someone in the queue ahead of him, and if that's not evidence that he's been doing a bit of dreaming, I don't know what is. So why isn't Boaz married already? That's not the only question I've got. Given how industrious and tenacious Ruth is, what she's been illustrated to be up to this point in the narrative, what strikes me about this chapter is Ruth's response to Naomi's plan of going to Boaz. She's very passive. Did you see it in verse 5? Naomi announces his plan, and what does Ruth say? She replied, all you say I will do. That's incredibly passive. She doesn't negotiate or argue. But there's more. She asks Boaz to marry her. And then she just said, waits, doesn't do anything else. Doesn't keep at him. And even after he agrees to marry her, she follows his instructions exactly and tactfully spends the night on the threshing floor. She doesn't come up with a better plan or even a slight modification. And then when she returns to her mother-in-law, she needs to wait for the resolution to the problem. That's where we leave the story at the end of the chapter, waiting for the community to deliberate. I can't help but imagine the butterflies in her stomach. But the text isn't interested in that. It raises it as a question. The more I thought about these details, actually, the more they bugged me. So how do we go forward? How do we see what God is saying to us in this chapter? Well, here's a couple of things, and they're in no particular order, really. Firstly, do notice that last thing I was talking about. We don't get explicit insight into the internals, the thoughts and the feelings of the characters, right? That's not the focus of the story. I mean, Ruth follows Naomi's plan. Does she kind of already have a hankering for Boaz? Has she noticed his kind of brawny shoulders and, being developed from years in the fields? Or is she just a pawn in a larger game of providing for the daily necessities of life? Is Naomi being manipulative, using the beautiful young Ruth to seduce the wealthy older Boaz? Or is Naomi being kind? Is Boaz being generous, looking after Ruth and Naomi? Or is he just a lecherous old man who can't wait to get his hands on this young woman? Well, we're just not told so many of the questions we might like answers to. And so I think it's important for us to just slow down before we jump to the conclusion that Ruth is a moral exemplar, and that's the point of the story. It'd be a mistake, I think, to look at Ruth and say, this is Ruth. This is how you do life. Be like Ruth. That doesn't mean she can't be helpful examples at some points. But because we're not told what to think about what they're doing, and because narratives show rather than tell, and because the climate in which we live today, I think it's easy to be suspicious as we read Ruth, and easy to impose our questions on the text. I mean, I was out to dinner a couple of weeks ago with a men's group. All they wanted to know about was there sex involved on the threshing floor that night. You know who you are. And I wonder if that's just a reflection of our culture, actually. See, what I think's in the chapter, loving submission to others, is something that just makes sense less and less in a culture like ours. We tend to see every set of events through the lens of what people are getting out of it for themselves. Life's about power. Who's got it? Who doesn't got it? What to do about that? I wonder if fewer and fewer people consider themselves accountable to a good and just and sovereign God in the next world, whether the most important thing in this world becomes the here and now. And the most important activity, therefore, now becomes winning at politics, because politics is all about dividing up power. And the idea that you might set aside your own power and authority, or to use your power and influence for the good of others, it's inconceivable. And so our politics becomes less and less about how to do good to others than being about burying the opposition. And I wonder whether you saw that in the church riot nearly 2 weeks ago, which appears to be a taking into one's own hands the law. Well, I do want us to be careful. It's not just them, the political class, and it's not just them, those people in Wakeling. There's an issue for us. Back to Ruth. So, in the face of all that's going on around us, we know this story, Ruth, is about the ways of God in this world. And although the Lord never steps to the front of the stage in this book, as it were, his presence is everywhere, through his providence, through acts of kindness. And although he never speaks directly, his name is on the lips of his people constantly. The book's about chesed love, this love of God's, love with no exit strategy, his love for the people of Israel, and it's what gives shape and purpose to their lives and to ours. And that brings me back to Ruth's apparently passive behaviour in the chapter, which in truth is an act of love. And the clincher for me for that conclusion is in verse 10. Boaz said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You've made this last kindness, chesed, greater than the first in that you've not gone after young men, whether rich or poor." Because Ruth loved her mother-in-law, she gave up continuing to live in the land where she was born, where she grew up. That's the first kindness that Boaz refers to, by the way. But the second is extraordinary too. I mean, I didn't say it before, but isn't Naomi's plan just bonkers? Right? She says to a Moabite widow, yes, the Moabites, whose seduced Israelite men when they were on their way to the land, go and check that out in Numbers 25. She says to a Moabite woman, go wash, put on perfume and clean clothes, and go and propose marriage to a bloke in the middle of the night on the threshing floor when there's no one else around, and he'll probably marry you. And Ruth does it. And what is notable about Ruth is she keeps putting herself last. She clings to her mother-in-law. She's left her own gods behind to pledge herself to the God of Israel. She goes to live where she'll be a foreigner so that her mother-in-law is not deserted. And here in this foreign land, she submits herself to Naomi. Not in a miserable way. It's just in line with her vow in chapter 1 to cling to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. To change her allegiances, to show love with no exit strategy. And the kindness of her actions is seen and told by Boaz in chapter 2 when they meet on the harvest field. Chapter 2 verse 11, all that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people you didn't know before. The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. And what we learn, I think, is that by leaving her own people and her own gods, by committing herself to Naomi and to her people, Ruth has in fact sought refuge under the wings of Yahweh, the God of Israel. But at this point in the story, Ruth hasn't yet been incorporated into the people of Israel, into the people of God. As friendly and hospitable as Boaz and his workers have been, and Naomi, even though she's back in the land, is not yet seeing her family multiply and fill the inherited family farm. Belongs to some other bloke at the moment. And someone, a redeemer, needs to buy it back. You see, things aren't quite right yet. So when Ruth comes to Boaz in the middle of the night and says, spread your wings over me, we know what she's asking for. It's not just a marriage proposal, but a way of continuing her Hesed love for Naomi. And I want to encourage you to be readers who keep pressing against those bits of the Bible that just don't make sense to you. Usually when I do that, I find, actually there's something I didn't understand before when I find the answer to it. It's a really good strategy to have. Don't ever be afraid of not knowing the answers to things. Where I think we end up with this chapter, taking into account those questions, is that we're seeing Ruth invites Boaz to play a role in fulfilling his own prayer from chapter 2. May you find refuge in the Lord, under whose wings you've come. And the wings of Boaz's cloak are one of the ways in which the Lord will cover her with his wings. It's part of the way that God will care for all three of them, actually. And there's more. Because the real beauty of this clandestine marriage proposal is that each of the people, not just Ruth, are putting the needs of the others first. Just take a moment to think about what's going on there for each person. It's so contrary to our culture's way of doing things. I mean, if Naomi had just wanted her land back, she could have gone to the unnamed Redeemer that Boaz spoke about, but she wanted rest for her daughter-in-law, as she says in verse 1. which is that Ruth be married to a worthy man. So she tries to draw Boaz out with this bold plan. And Ruth, see, if Ruth just wanted to belong to Israel through marriage, she could have gone after one of those exciting young farmhands, as Boaz mentions. Boaz might be a worthy man, but he's no spring chicken. And thirdly, Boaz, if he just wanted Ruth as his wife, he could have gone to Naomi or even taken her on the floor that night in the threshing room. I mean, they are already eating out of his largesse, but he's righteous in his dealings with her. And even more, assuming that Ruth wants a younger man, he has stayed in the background. He doesn't use the power that he has over Ruth and Naomi because of his wealth to get Ruth as a wife or even a concubine. And in each of these three characters, we see the exercise of chesed, love. They put the other first. And God in his kindness draws them together. And I want to say this is such a beautiful picture. But the conclusion doesn't come until next week, which is appropriate. Because what is the outcome we're all looking for? Everyone's waiting for? We want consummation. We've got the marriage proposal already. We've got this lovely young woman, Ruth. We've got this upstanding bloke, Boaz, with a belly full of wine and good food. She's bathed and perfumed. They're really into each other. And they're surrounded by the earthy and somewhat sensual smell of freshly threshed grain. I had to practice that. The consummation is not what we're given in chapter 3, is it? We've got the promise, but it's yet to be enfleshed. And I think that's not so different from our redemption in Jesus, great David's greater son, who's gone to extraordinary lengths to woo us, to offer himself for us, to put us first. And yet our true relationship with him is still cloaked in darkness. He's pledged himself to us by becoming one of us. And he has for all time demonstrated his love for us in the cross. Forgiveness out of his wealth at no cost to anyone who come to him, who trusts his sacrifice to deal with our great debt with God. For we, all of us, live in this world, but we most of the time want all the stuff God gives, but don't want a relationship with him. And we live our lives ignoring him. And we elevate the stuff he's made to the place that really only he deserves. We live our lives as rebels against the real ruler of heaven and earth. And in the face of that rejection, Jesus still loves us. And he sends our spirit, his spirit, when we trust him. Actually, so we can trust him, to change our hearts, so our faces aren't turned away, so they're turned towards him. And for all who accept him, he sends his spirit into us, that our hearts would be daily persuaded and re-persuaded of his hesed love for us. So we wait patiently for his return to claim us as his own for all to see. You see how Ruth's working to propose that dynamic of God's love. See, his love is patient and kind and doesn't envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It doesn't insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with truth. His love bears all things and believes all things and hopes all things and endures all things. His love never ends. And this is your God who invites you to shelter under his wings this day, this moment, until he returns.